Hello, welcome to the next video lesson, this time focusing on the inspector, the character of the inspector in An Inspector Calls. Before I continue, just a reminder as ever that there are plenty more of these video lessons over on mrhonline.co.uk where you can see me, Mr. H, talk you through a whole load of themes and characters and plots and how to tackle a question on a whole range of texts that you'll be studying for your GCSE literature as well as language. Okay, let's carry on with the inspector. Okay, so as ever, who is he and what were Priestley's possible intentions behind the character of the inspector in An Inspector Calls? Okay, well, he's an inspector and he's come to investigate the circumstances surrounding the suicide of a young woman, the terrible suicide, the horrific suicide of a young woman. Now, it's really important to remember, you have to understand where Priestley was coming from writing this play. Remember, he's a socialist. He wanted social change. He wanted a far better community spirit and a caring consideration for everybody in society. With that in mind, the inspector is Priestley's mouthpiece on stage. He represents Priestley's strong socialist views throughout. He challenges Berling and, as a consequence, challenges capitalism throughout. Not only does he challenge the characters, he challenges the audience to think about their treatment of the working classes. The fact that he appears to operate outside of time, it could be argued that it lends a greater authority to his role. Now, I'll just come back to that. I do say there that you can check out a video lesson on literary devices and structure within the play as well. But just to fill you in on what I mean about time, Priestley himself was a great fan of a Russian philosopher called Uspensky. And Uspensky believed that when we died, we re-entered our lives back at the beginning again. If we made significant spiritual progress through the second shot at life, we'd carry on to the next life. If we didn't, we'd have to go back to the beginning again. Now, if you apply that to An Inspector Calls, you can see a correlation. The family have acted immorally, perhaps. They've each in their own way treated this young woman poorly. An inspector comes, he interrogates them, he gives them an opportunity to own up and confess to their wrongdoings. And then at the end of the play, we see which characters have changed. Have they changed enough? Well, the older Burlings, not at all. Gerald, not really. Eric, a little bit perhaps. Sheila's undergone a great transformation. But what's the very last thing that happens in the play? Telephone rings. Telephone rings to announce what? The arrival of an inspector, because a young girl has just died. So it's almost right back to the start again. Now, the question is, will the Burlings have learned any of their lessons from the first inspector's visit? Well, we don't know. We can have a guess at that. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. His main role, I've cut a bit of that off at the top, sorry. His main role, so some thoughts. And you can pause this and jot down some notes as well as you go. He interrupts the family celebration at precisely the moment Mr. Burling is expressing his capitalist views. And I've got this quote later on. This foreshadows the ensuing challenge the inspector presents to those views. Remember, he's the socialist, Priestley's mouthpiece. Burling represents capitalism. Upon his arrival, Priestley instructs, remember the stage directions, instructs that the lighting should become brighter and harder, implying that the family is now under the spotlight, perhaps in a search for truth, white being the colour of truth. Remember, it was pink and intimate to reflect the celebration. The inspector has very clear authority throughout. He's not easily intimidated, despite their best efforts. Employing the one line of inquiry at a time, which is in the stage directions introducing him, method, he establishes that each of them played a significant role in the young woman's suicide. This helps build tension as well. He's always in control, despite repeated efforts to intimidate, and leaves the family after making an impassioned plea for them to amend their ways. We'll have a look at that speech as well. He's integral to the build-up of tension, in particular his insistence of interrogating one character at a time, which leaves the audience wondering about the remaining characters' involvement. And finally, he leaves an impression on the younger Burlings, who align themselves more with him than their own parents. Remember, Sheila says, "It frightens me how you speak." And Eric says, "We still killed her." Okay, so now pause the video. I want you to interpret two parts of this opening stage direction. Remember, you cannot answer, you should not answer a question in the exam without incorporating stage directions, be it character or theme. So how is he introduced by Priestley? Well, Priestley says or states that he need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. And he has the disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. Okay, so pause it, and I want a couple of interpretations from this. Okay, there we go. He creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. That's a rule of three for a technique, but this implies he will be a strong, dominant character, more than a match for Burling. Remember, Burling up to this point has dominated proceedings. He's spoken the most, he's offered advice where none was asked for. He talks about how he's a hard-headed man of business and so on and so forth. We get the impression from this introduction to the inspector that he's going to challenge that and subsequently challenge his views. This disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. This suggests that he will intimidate the other characters rather than be intimidated by them. And that proves correct. That rings true as we discover. Okay, so I've got a couple of pages, a couple of screens of quotations, key quotations that you can use from the inspector. So first up, she was in great agony. That's emotive language to elicit sympathy from the audience for Eva Smith. She was in great agony. Makes her sound, even more of a victim, more innocent. And then to describe her kind of position in society before that, young women counting their pennies in their dingy little back rooms. This is Priestley's and the inspector's commentary on the reality of life for working class women at that time. One line of inquiry at a time reflects his methodical approach, adds to the build-up of tension. He won't be swayed. He won't even show the same photograph to more than one person, or more than one person at a time, sorry. To develop the sympathy for Eva Smith, a pretty lively sort of girl who never did anybody any harm. She didn't deserve the fate that befell her. Each of you helped to kill her. So his blunt assessment of their roles links to Priestley's wish that we all take responsibility for each other. Each of you helped to kill her, proving as the opening stage directions implied, he will intimidate them. He won't be intimidated by them. Now, Priestley offering hope for the future in reference to how the inspector has influenced Sheila and Eric, Sheila in particular. And he said, we often do on the young ones. They're more impressionable. Okay, Priestley didn't want to end on a sour note, on a negative necessarily. He wanted to offer hope that there is a chance for us in society that if we change, it will be a better place for all of us. Okay, and here we've got public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. Just an example of how he challenges Arthur Burling and his attitude. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. And then his final speech. Now, I've broken his final speech down into these little sections. Although ostensibly his final speech is for the family, it's really for us, the audience, as well. It's a warning. And he says, millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. A reminder that the plight of Eva Smith is perhaps symbolic of all working class people. Okay, so you've got repetition of millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smith. Most common name at the time, surname at the time, was Smith. Eva could have a link to Adam and Eve, first woman born. So you could argue she represents all of working class women. With their lives, their hopes and fears, their chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives. So this is Priestley's strong socialist beliefs coming through. That doesn't sound too harsh. Their hopes and fears, chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives. Why shouldn't we all have a chance of happiness? Reinforcing his socialist views, we are responsible for each other. Now, if we don't change our ways, here's the warning. We will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Now, what could he, I should say, not cold, I've got the cold, what could he have been referring to here? Well, it was set in 1912. It was produced or performed in 1946. So 2 world wars had occurred. So there's the warning. The last thing the public wanted at the time was a 3rd World War. So, the warning's quite stark. Change your ways and, that we will be free from repeating the mistakes of the past. Okay, so it's key to focus on his final speech. Okay, now what impact did his departure have? Well, I'll go to the stage directions again. So he walked straight out, leaving them staring, subdued and wondering. So there's Priestley's a rule of 3, highlighting the contrast in mood with the celebratory one as the play started. And so individually, Sheila is quietly crying. Mrs. Burling has collapsed into a chair. She's completely beaten, stark contrast with her earlier arrogance and obstinacy. Eric is brooding desperately. He kind of was at the beginning as well, but he's even more so now because he's realised the role his mother in particular had with the pregnant Eva Smith. Burling, the only active one, hears the front door slam, moves hesitatingly towards the door but stops, looks gloomily at the other 3, then pours himself out a drink, which he hastily swallows. So compare this to his assured confidence and arrogance in the opening scenes. He hardly knows what to do. He's even nervous of opening the door again, maybe for fear of what may lie ahead. So these are the stage directions describing the impact his presence had. Once they've composed themselves somewhat and believe they've uncovered a hoax against them, the older Burlings in jail revert back to type, joking about how they've been had and acting as if nothing had happened at all. By contrast, the 2 younger Burlings appear profoundly affected by what has been revealed and vowed to challenge the prevailing views of their parents. It appears the inspector has had the biggest impact on the young, again, as I've said before, which is Priestley offering hope that the future will involve a fairer society for all. Okay, and final screen, I kind of do this typically. How is this relevant to a potential exam question? How can you incorporate the inspector into an exam question? Well, any question theme that comes up, capitalism or socialism, you can link him. Social responsibility and community, you can link him. Priestley himself and context, you can link him. Class and status, what does he say? How does he comment on the abuse of power that the Burlings and other manufacturers and wealth owners inflict on the working classes? The working classes on whom they're absolutely dependent to accrue their wealth in the first place. And any question that comes up on generation, his influence on the young as opposed to the older, and maybe less confidently with gender, and also any question on any of the other characters and their interaction with Mr. Burling, the effect or the influence that the inspector has had. Sorry, the inspector, any influence the inspector's had on them. Okay, so that's plenty for the inspector. Hope you've made lots of notes, and we'll see you back for another video. All right, bye guys.